Civility in politics. Is it really as bad as it seems? Then, a look at Tucson's connection to the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro. And who has the best Mexican food in the U.S.? A city councilwoman explains Tucson's claim to that title. This is Metro Week. Candidates for every office, from president to county supervisor, can choose to lob a zinger at their opponents. But when do they cross the line and become uncivil? We'll tackle that question, but first, a look at the week's news.
Republican David Gowan has suspended his campaign for the seat in Arizona's 1st congressional district. The Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives was one of 6 Republicans vying to be the party's nominee in the district, which stretches from Oro Valley to the Utah state line. The University of Arizona's proposed veterinary school has hit a stumbling block with attaining accreditation. The American Veterinary Medicine Association says it does not have enough information to approve the new U of A doctoral program. The university plans to appeal the decision. Tucson is drying out after a rainy week. An outer band of Tropical Storm Javier brought wet weather across southern Arizona. Official measurements taken at Tucson International Airport showed less than an inch of rain total, but precipitation gauges around town tracked more than 3 inches. Tucson Fire Department responded to 75 flooding-related calls, 8 of which were swiftwater rescues. The Arizona Supreme Court has overturned a lower court's decision and will allow Arizona water companies recent rate hikes, saying such incremental changes are allowed if they cover infrastructure improvements. For more on all the news, visit our website, news.azpm.org.
In politics, what constitutes incivility? It's hard to define. Perhaps we only know something isn't civil when we see it and have a gut reaction. Here's a look at how incivility is manifesting itself in the current election cycle. Is booing uncivil? What about protesting? Or is civility more about the tone of the message conveyed in words and actions? To get you thinking about it, here's some comments that drew reactions during the national political party conventions last month.
I will vote for Hillary with gusto, as I continue to be inspired and moved to action by the ideals set forth by Bernie, who will never stop fighting for us. I am proud to be a part of Bernie's movement, and a vital part of that movement is making absolutely sure that Hillary Clinton is our next president of the United States. Booyah, Baba Booey.
Hillary.
Unity, unity, unity.
Hillary.
Can I just say to the Bernie or bust people, you're being ridiculous.
And to those listening, please don't stay home in November. If you love our country and love your children as much as I know that you do, stand and speak and vote your conscience. Vote for candidates up and down the ticket who you trust to defend our freedom and to be faithful to the Constitution.
The definition of civility emphasizes politeness, but as we see all the time, that doesn't always translate to politics and governance in action. I asked the director of the Tucson-based National Institute for Civil Discourse to talk about the political cycle so far. Carolyn Lukensmeyer works in Washington, D.C., and she joined me in the studio last week. In the realm of political discourse, are things getting better, worse, staying the same?
You know, it's very interesting. Pew has done some research on the issue of particularly civil discourse and when does discourse turn into violence. And the vast majority of the American public believes that this is much worse now than it has been in the past. Something above 70% of Americans actually think incivility in politics is at a crisis stage.
Wow.
Part of what concerns us the most at the National Institute for Civil Discourse, in that same poll, 38% of Americans say they've just come to expect that kind of behavior in politics. So when that percentage of the American public thinks that what we're watching now is just the way it is, I think that's of high concern.
And the premise, of course, of your job is that it shouldn't be what we expect.
Absolutely not. And in the history of political campaigns, there have been both violent behavior way back in the 1800s and in civil dialogue. But political scientists that follow this closely say what we're watching right now is the worst that's been seen since Reconstruction after the Civil War.
Now, you recently singled out a New Hampshire state politician who called for Hillary Clinton's execution. That seems to be an extreme example of the way politicians talk about each other or the policies or the issues at hand. What's the threshold? How do you decide when you're going to call somebody out?
Thank you for the question. We decided in this season, we both wanted to highlight examples where elected officials, candidates were doing the right thing and calling out people who crossed a line. We actually have put up on our website Standards for Civility, which any of your viewers could go to at www.nicd.arizona.edu/standards. We choose to call someone out when our judgment is that what they have done from their leadership position is so inappropriate that attention has to be called. And Andrea, it's just not acceptable for an elected official, for anyone of a public stature, to suggest that someone should be killed.
What are the repercussions, or has there been any, of you singling out that person for that comment?
Actually, the only responses we've gotten thus far have been positive. People are saying, this has gone too far. We need people, we need institutions to stand up and say, this isn't acceptable. Now, what I put up online is going to be put as a letter to the editor in the Concord Monitor, coming out sometime this week. So given that that is his home state, potentially we'll get a wider range of responses. But to date, it has all been positive.
Do you risk, when you call somebody out for such a statement, giving them more airtime? I mean, we're talking about it on a TV show right now.
That is a judgment call as well. And I actually I know again from polling that it's something the public feels strongly that through this campaign period, media has, by repeating things time and time and time again, actually done exactly what you just said. Yes, the potential for that is there. I think in this case, it is such an egregious violation of how a public persona should be expressing himself in a leadership position that it was a risk worth taking.
What can you do to drive change here?
Well, what we are doing, and it came about for two reasons. We were hearing very much from the public. When I write a blog on Huffington Post or a blog on Medium, which is probably where you saw this, we get hundreds of responses every time I do that from people in red states, blue states, purple states, all expressing that they are disgusted with the current political environment. They are frustrated, they are embarrassed, ashamed is a word that started to show up quite a bit. But often they say, but what can we do? It's a kind of giving up. And as you well know, social science has long demonstrated, political science calls it agency. When I as a person am frustrated by something, if I take an action, it keeps my sense of well-being. It keeps me moving forward. But if I just feel it and I don't do anything, then I kind of collapse. It leads to depression in severe cases. So because the public was asking us, we wanted to start a campaign for civility. We call it Reviving Civility. Our democracy depends on it. And the website I mentioned before is how people join. What I think is very interesting, in the same time we were doing the research for the standards, we got called by the Presidential Debate Commission. They said to us, we don't want the general election debates to devolve and degrade into the same mudslinging that we've seen in the primary. And we think, given the mission of the National Institute of Civil Discourse, given how you started, given who your national board is, that you could be like the housekeeping good seal of approval for your audience members that are old enough to remember that. And basically, they asked us to do standards for the general election debates, standards for the candidates, for the moderators, recognizing that sometimes the moderators were inappropriate in the primary, and for the audience, because you will remember there were times when the audience, often egged on by the candidates, but when the audience members themselves got out of line. So we've done the research, we've done focus groups, we've done a survey monkey of voting on these standards, and we've presented them back to the Presidential Debate Commission.
So we might see some of that in October when those debates
Exactly.
get going. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Now to a different part of the political cycle, the way candidates campaign. Christopher Conover took a look this week at grassroots campaigning and then joined me in the studio.
In the days before television, radio, and social media, political candidates had to get out and meet with voters in order to spread their message. The electronic age has changed campaigning, but candidates still spend time shaking hands and kissing babies. The practice, now known as grassroots campaigning, may seem old-fashioned and a time-consuming way to reach voters, but candidates say it's still very effective.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Even campaigns for president must spend time holding rallies, signing autographs, and posing for selfies.
What else, aside from those examples you gave, is grassroots campaigning?
The big thing that most candidates do as grassroots campaigning is knocking on doors. The candidates in the 2nd Congressional District race, which I wrote a story for our radio site on grassroots campaigning, they're each out in neighborhoods in the district, all over Pima County, all over Cochise County, walking around, knocking on doors, introducing themselves to people, answering questions. I spent some time with candidate Victoria Steele doing that. And the other thing is making phone calls. Very often when we think of candidate phone calls, it's candidates calling for fundraising purposes, but that's not the only reason they make phone calls. The candidates actually, and their volunteers, pick up the phone and call voters. I was with candidate Matt Hines, same race, doing that. He would call people up and say, "Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Hines and I'm running for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District." And he would talk to people. And these are the ways that they get out and meet people.
Why is this such a focal point for so many campaigns?
It comes down to, I think, some of the idea that all politics is local, and if you know the person, you have a connection with them. Both the candidates, Hines and Steele, both told me stories about meeting people out while knocking on doors and having them show up in their campaign offices a week later as big supporters, getting signs and volunteering for their campaigns. And these were when both these candidates were in the legislature, and those voters are still with them now. So it's that personal touch.
So what is not grassroots? What can be eliminated from that category? What kind of campaigning?
Obviously TV. When we see these candidates on TV, that's not grassroots. It's going to everybody. Mailers, although they're very targeted, are kind of on the edge. Grassroots still comes down to that personal, you have an opportunity to actually talk to the candidate, shake the candidate's hand, these days pose for a selfie with the candidate, something like that. Parades, July 4th is always a big one, and most of the candidates were out at parades, waving, walking down the street, talking to people, shaking hands during the parade.
We've heard so much lately about how social media and electronic communications have really helped campaigns. That was what drove the donations to President Obama's campaigns and Bernie Sanders, especially those small dollar donations. But you're saying they still really put the heart of their energy into being able to shake someone's hand, touching someone physically.
They want to get out and meet the people, meet their constituents or their hoped future constituents. If you look at rallies, that's why candidates still hold rallies. You know, Mike Pence, Donald Trump's vice presidential candidate, was here in Tucson last week. 1,000 people showed up. Those are 1,000 people he connected with. Now, obviously, he didn't shake every hand, talk to every person there, but there's more of a personal connection than just seeing Donald Trump or Mike Pence come on during the Olympics or during nightly news coverage or whatever it is on TV.
Why do we call it grassroots campaigning? Or the exception was Gabrielle Giffords called it cactus roots. Why do we use those names?
It's just a name that goes back, and it's the base level. It's the lowest level of campaigning, if you will, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It is getting back to the basics, the grassroots, the beginnings of everything. If we go back, as we said in the opening of this, and talk about campaigns before broadcast, before radio, before TV, this is the way it was done. You had to get out and meet people. You had to make what were at the time called stump speeches, where candidates literally stood on stumps so more people could see them in a crowd. That's where that phrase comes from. And took questions and made speeches, and that's where this all comes from.
Well, thanks for sharing your reporting on this.
Thank you.
A number of Tucsonans, including U of A athletes, are in Brazil right now competing in the Olympics. AZPM's Tony Perkins has that story.
Aquatic events are traditionally among the biggest draws for those watching the Olympic Games at home. They receive the most attention from media covering the Olympics, and United States swimmers went to Rio as the favorites in many of their competitions. Kevin Cordes claimed the American record in the 100-meter breaststroke during the U.S. Olympic trials, so he went to Rio with high expectations. Cordes won several NCAA and Pac-12 conference honors during a 4-year career at the University of Arizona. But the Arizona athlete boasting the longest list of Olympic credits is track and field veteran Bernard Lagat. He's a native Kenyan who moved to Tucson. Next week, the 41-year-old will be running the 5,000-meter competition against men half his age. Lagat holds 8 USA records in athletics and is a volunteer assistant coach for the U of A's track and field program.
Tony Perkins is here with me now to catch up on how those athletes are doing. Let's start with Kevin Cordes.
Well, Andrea, Kevin Cordes, 24 years old, and this really because of his age and the fact that the Olympics come around only every 4 years, this might have been his only really good shot at winning a medal at the Olympics. He was 4th place in the 100-meter breaststroke on Sunday night, only 8th place on Wednesday night in the 200-meter breaststroke. So sort of disappointing. He had a lot of NCAA honors, Pac-12 conference honors here at the University of Arizona. But when you move up to the international level, that's a completely different thing. Kevin Cordes went to Singapore to train for the Olympics, to get ready. And of course, it turned out that in the first race that he ran, the guy who beat him, got the gold medal, set a world record from Great Britain. The second race, a guy from Kazakhstan, won the race. So, no matter how high his hopes were and how good that he did, all the honors that he got here in the United States, going to the international level was a lot more difficult for him at the Olympics.
And then track athlete Lagat is from Kenya, you said. How did he end up in Tucson and at the U of A?
Well, Bernard Lagat from Kenya, competed for his home country for a couple of Olympic Games, but he came to the United States to train. He was attending Washington State University, in fact, and his coach, James Lee, decided to move to the University of Arizona here in Tucson. And Mr. Lagat followed him here to Tucson. It turns out great weather, of course, really good training facilities. Oddly enough, a lot of athletes are doing this. Michael Phelps moved from Baltimore to Phoenix to get ready for this Olympic Games. So Arizona is becoming a really good place for athletes on the international level, especially to find that they've got great facilities, great places to train, and great places to be ready for the Olympic Games.
Now, what other athletes have a Tucson connection and competing in the Olympics this year?
Well, a lot of University of Arizona student athletes from other countries are here, and of course they from the university they get ready and compete for their home countries at the Olympic Games. Rafael Quintero is a diver. He's from Puerto Rico. He is going to likely make some headlines at the Olympics during this next week. Michael Mayer from South Africa, a swimmer. You seem to have a lot of swimmers who are from the U of A competing for their home countries. They may not do that great, but they're an embodiment of the Olympic ideal that to participate is the important thing. Winning comes second. The whole Olympic experience is a big thing, and I think those University of Arizona student athletes are finding that out.
Now, you covered the Beijing Olympics in 2008, so obviously now you're just a spectator like the rest of us. But what's different in your perspective between those two games?
Well, one thing as a reporter in 2008 was, we didn't have social media back then. And it sounds like a lifetime ago because we have social media now all the time with Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook. The biggest thing we had back then was Skype. And so we didn't really have the insight, the connections with the athletes. Like this year, they're talking about athletes talking to each other about drug cheats and performing enhancement drugs and who should be at the Olympics and who should not. We didn't have those controversies. Security-wise, even though there is always a threat of terrorism at every Olympic Games, since 1972, Beijing was almost the most secure place on the planet. Oh, wow. One thing, in fact, that the Chinese government did is they had a show of security guards, armed security guards, marching in formation through the Olympic site, and almost a show that there's not going to be any trouble here because we've got too many security people to watch over the place. So Beijing, really it was very, very different from Rio, but the constant, which is very interesting, is that the star in Beijing in 2008 was Michael Phelps. The star in Rio this year is Michael Phelps.
It all comes back to swimming again.
Right.
Thanks for your insight, Tony. Earlier this year, UNESCO named Tucson a World City of Gastronomy. It's the only city in the United States with that designation, and now local officials are trying to take advantage of the potential that title holds. It's a title, though, that needs some introduction. Here's an excerpt from a package produced by AZPM's Andrew Brown for Arizona Illustrated.
People say, oh, I heard that Tucson got the designation, and I didn't know there were that many fancy restaurants in Tucson. The immediate response is like, oh my God, there is so much more than fancy restaurants in the meaning of this designation.
Maribel Alvarez helped put together Tucson's application for the designation. She explains it's important to understand the context of the word gastronomy.
In the European context, it's a much wider term. It's really equivalent to what we in folklore and anthropology will call food waste, which includes the whole set of practices around food.
When you look at the body of work around local food and around food heritage, clearly Tucson is a leader.
Hello there, how are you?
This is Market on the Move. For only a $10 donation, anyone in Tucson can get 60 pounds of produce every week with no strings attached. From produce brokers in Rio Rico and Nogales, Pam Boyer and company get these fruits and vegetables that would otherwise go to the landfill and make them available to Tucson residents like the Platts.
This much in the store would be $50, $60 easily. And for $10, we can can it, store it, and freeze it. And it's excellent. Excellent. It helps out that way.
When you start to list all of the resources like this in Tucson, the list grows long quickly. Tucson has integrative school gardens, mobile soup patrols, innovative culinary training programs like Caridad Community Kitchen. The Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona is recognized as a national leader. It even sponsors farmers markets.
Having this designation is something that we can market as a region, and we can market it for all sorts of reasons. Yes, our fine and unique restaurants, but also our native food culture, our local food culture, our farms, and we're doing that, and that's already having an impact.
These things were always here. They were always present, and only a few people knew about it. So now we have the opportunity to connect all the dots and raise a big sort of tent under which all of these things can be seen for what they are.
And now Tucson City Councilwoman Regina Romero joins me to talk about an initiative related to that UNESCO designation. This week, Tucson declared that it has the best 23 miles of Mexican food in the United States. So how did you come to that designation?
Well, in my quest to improve the infrastructure, roads, pedestrian landscaping, beautification of South 12th Avenue, I came upon into conversation with Chris DeSimone, who does a guided tour of 12th Avenue. He calls it the best of the barrio Mexican food. And he does it with Gray Line Tours. And he approached our office and said, hey, since you're so interested in doing infrastructure improvements on South 12th Avenue, this is what we're doing. We're bringing people, charging money to come to 12th Avenue and enjoy authentic culinary and cultural traditions that we have there. And so since then, he thought up of hey, we should create this plan that declares that Tucson has the best mileage of Mexican food. And so we kind of gathered our heads and said, well, these are the areas in town that has generational restaurants that have amazing cultural Mexican food, and it ended up to 23 miles.
We actually have a map of that. So how do you sort of designate, I mean, there's obviously restaurants outside of that zone who are just as amazing. How did you come up with that exact space?
We looked at, for example, in the downtown areas, El Charro, which is the longest running Mexican restaurant in the country. We looked through South 4th Avenue, where we have Minidito and so many other wonderful places. We looked into 12th Avenue that has Los Abson, taquerias, and seafood restaurants, and BK and Güero Canelo. And so we kind of looked in the geographic area where Mexican food has been traditional and family, generational business. So we kind of decided on a 23 miles within the city of Tucson that is mostly downtown, central, south, and west Tucson. But you know, it's just a geography in terms of a map, and it's mostly to give it a name. But there are restaurants that have been calling and say, hey, we're wonderful Mexican food. We want to be included in this marketing effort of the city of Tucson. And of course, we're going to add whomever needs to be added. Visit Tucson is another wonderful partner in this effort. And Visit Tucson has been pretty clear about the economic impact that food tourism has in the city of Tucson. So it's a great effort. We put it together, and it's something that we approved a resolution at the city of Tucson, and it's official.
So is that one of the goals, to bring some more tourism because of this?
Absolutely. Part of any economic development plan, which the city of Tucson, we've been working on for the last 8 years or more, since the economic recession. We've created incentives, we've improved an infrastructure investment downtown, we've done a lot of effort to improve our economy and create jobs. Most recently with the addition of Caterpillars, which we're very happy. But part of that economic development plan is tourism. And here in Tucson, we enjoy a $2 billion tourism industry just from Mexico visitors alone. So we thought that we wanted to, the millennials and younger generations visit places to have an authentic experience. And so we felt that Mexican food, because of our history and our culture and our tradition, was something that we could really polish and put on a platter for food tourists.
Now, if Albuquerque or San Diego or El Paso comes calling and says, we kind of challenge whether you have the best, what are you going to say?
Well, we could say, you know, UNESCO has really put a stamp of approval on our claim. And UNESCO recognized our cultural traditions, more than 4,000 years of agricultural history, and that we have very authentic food. We're 45 minutes away from the border, but for centuries, our Sonoran-style food and Mexican food has been a tradition here. So I would say you don't have the Sonoran-style hot dog, and it's different, and it's something that has been recognized worldwide.
Thanks for coming in to talk about it with us.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for us. Next week, we'll look at the state's trade with Mexico. Thanks for watching.